Hey y'all, welcome back. I am still hard at work on my workshop trying to turn what started out as a boring gray box of a building into something that looks more like a little cottage sitting in our backyard. So far, I have built and installed shutters, painted the front door, and added skirting around the bottom of the building. And today is all about these steps. I just finished them. I'm really pleased with how they turned out. So let me show you how I did it. I've been using these concrete blocks as steps to my workshop ever since I had it built, so it was definitely time for an upgrade. Before I could build anything, I first needed to design my steps. I decided to build 3 frames and stack them on top of each other for my 3 different steps. The bottom frame would be 75 inches by 54 inches on the outside. But because the long pieces would be set inside the shorter pieces using 2-inch lumber, that means that I would cut the long pieces to 72 inches. And then inside that frame, I would put 3 support pieces. Those would be cut to 51 inches. And then on top of that frame, I would build a second frame. This one would be 75 inches on the outside by 42 inches to allow for that 12-inch step on the bottom. This one would also have 3 inside support pieces cut to 39 inches. And then on top of that, I would build a third frame for the top step. This one would be 30 inches by 75 inches on the outside with 3 inside support pieces cut to 27 inches. And once those 3 frames were stacked, I would have 3 steps, with the first 2 steps being 12 inches deep and then the top step being 30 inches deep. Once I had all the lengths of lumber that I would need, I could figure out how many 2x6 by 8 feet pieces of lumber I would need to buy. Also figured how many deck boards I would need for my steps. The deck boards are 5.5 inches wide and come in lengths of 10 feet and 8 feet. So I ended up buying the 8-foot boards for this. And then I also determined how many ledger screws I would need to screw the whole form to the building. And finally, I determined how many PVC boards I would need because I wanted the whole structure clad in PVC boards, the outside of the structure plus the risers on the steps. So with all of my calculations done, I was ready to go shopping. And just a heads up about pressure-treated lumber, there is specific lumber rated for ground contact, which is what I wanted because I'm going to build these steps directly on the ground. Not all pressure-treated lumber is the same. You can see here that this pressure-treated lumber says very specifically that it is not for use for ground contact. This lumber really should not be any closer than 6 inches from the ground. So this is not what I would need. Just be very careful when selecting your pressure-treated lumber depending on the project that you're going to build. If it's on the ground, it needs to be rated for ground contact. So here are all of my supplies for my steps. They did not have 2x6 pressure-treated lumber for ground contact, so I ended up having to buy 2x12 lumber, which is fine. I ended up spending a little bit less and having to buy half as many boards, and I can rip 2x6s and 2x12s just as easily with my circular saw. So I also bought my PVC boards, 2x6s, and I bought the decking boards. These are cedar decking boards that I'm going to use for the steps. Then I bought these mending plates to secure the 3 different forms to each other. These things are very sharp, and they're usually installed with a hydraulic press, which of course I do not have. So I'm just going to be using a hammer to put them in. It's not impossible to do this with a hammer. It's not preferable, but I don't think many of us have hydraulic presses sitting around our homes. So a hammer will have to do. And in addition to that, I got some 3-inch deck screws, these 5-inch ledger lock screws. This will be used for screwing the forms into the building. And a new circular saw blade, and then these exterior screws. I made sure to get the screws that are labeled specifically for use with pressure-treated lumber. So with my supplies in hand, I was ready to get started. I used my circular saw with a rip fence attached to it in order to rip all of the 2x12 boards to the width that I needed. Starting with the bottom form, the one that would sit right on the ground, I ripped these boards to 4 inches tall because I needed each step to be 5 inches. And so a 4-inch form with a 1-inch deck board on top of it would be 5 inches. So for this first form, I cut all of my boards to 4 inches. Here's a look at what I'm trying to describe. You can see that the bottom frame sits directly on the ground, and so a 4-inch high frame plus a 1-inch deck board would give me 5 inches. But the other frames would have 1 inch of the frame lost behind that deck board, and so those frames needed to be 5 inches high. Once I had all of my pieces cut for the first frame, I was ready to put it together. I used the 3-inch exterior screws to put this frame together. When I start working on the inside of my workshop, I'm going to build much better work tables. But for now, I kind of have to make do with these folding tables. It's not the ideal situation, but I generally can make it work. And with the outside of the frame put together, I was ready to put the 3 inside support pieces together. These would offer inside support for the decking boards, and they kind of act like floor joists. So just think of them as floor joists, which are spaced generally 16 inches on center. So you don't want to space these any more than 16 inches apart. I think mine ended up being 15 inches apart. And here's what that first frame looked like once I got it all put together. After this, I had to build 2 more frames, with each subsequent frame being 12 inches smaller. And then I dragged all the frames over and stacked them on top of each other. Here's what the first frame looks like in place, sandwiched between those skirting boards. And then I just stacked the second frame right on top and lined it up towards the building. And then I put the third frame right on top of that. And now you can kind of see the steps taking shape. So here's what it looked like at this point. You can kind of see that the steps are going to be unlevel, and the left side is hitting the threshold on the door. So I knew that I would have this problem. It wasn't a shock to me, but I did have to take my shovel and just kind of level out the ground a little bit, and also dig out a little bit on the left side. Also, I needed to cut away this trim. Everything from the threshold level under needed to be taken off so that the frame could sit flush against the siding of the building. I just used a straight edge right underneath the threshold to draw a line where it needed to be cut, and then I used my Dremel Multi-Max to cut away the trim that needed to be removed. Once that trim was gone and the ground was a little more level, I was ready to stack my frames on top of each other again and see what minor adjustments needed to be made. For this, I put a deck board on top just to see how the fit would work. And you can see it worked a lot better this time. I was about a 1/4 inch off, a 1/4 inch low on the right side, but that was okay for now. I went ahead and attached the frames to each other using the mending plates. These things, like I said, are generally installed with a hydraulic press, but my 3-pound hammer worked just fine. Obviously, a hammer is not going to make it look as nice and neat as a hydraulic press, but it'll still do the job. I ended up installing a total of 14 mending plates to hold these frames together. And then I was ready to test everything for level, and it was about a 1/4 inch low on the right side. So I used these composite shims just to shim the right side up that 1/4 inch and get everything level. Here you can see that it's just about as level as it can be. And now that everything was level, I was ready to attach the frames to the building. I used these very long, very strong ledger lock screws, and I used a total of 4 screws, one inside each section. Next, I was ready to cut and install the decking boards. I cut these to about 5 inches wider than the frames. And the reason is because I still needed to clad the frames with PVC boards, and those would add an inch to each side. And I wanted the final overhang on the steps on the side to be 1.5 inches on each side. I attached them starting with the board closest to the front of the step, the furthest away from the building. And I measured a 1 3/4 inch overhang on the front and 2.5 inches on the sides. And once I got that in place, I just screwed that front board into place. I did 1 screw on the right and then went to the other side and checked my measurements one more time before screwing that side into place. And then I filled in the rest of the screws and moved on to the second board. You could see me there using my level. I wasn't checking level of anything. I was just using my level as a straight edge to make sure that my boards were perfectly lined up. Once that front board was in place, the rest of it went very quickly and very easily. Then all I had to do is just cut down the back board, which had to be ripped with the circular saw and the rip fence. So I just slid that into place and then screwed that into the frame. And here's what the steps look like once they were finished. Of course, I did the first and the second step in the exact same way that I did that top step. The process was just the same. I also decided to go ahead and stain the steps before I quit for the first work day because I needed that stain to be dry by the time I added the PVC boards. Before I added the PVC boards, I added these 1/4 inch spacers, and the reason for this is that I wanted, if water gets in between those two boards, I wanted the water to be able to drain quickly. I didn't want it to get trapped between the PVC boards and the pressure-treated lumber. I also added the same 1/4 inch spacers on the front risers of the steps. And then I did the same thing on the other side of the frame. spacers in place, I was ready to cut the PVC boards to be attached to the outside of the frame and to the risers. I cut them to the lengths to go just to cover the pressure treated lumber. I used my miter saw for this. And then I used my table saw to rip them to the right height because I needed them to cover the boards that had already been ripped down to specific sizes. I cut these PVC boards to the same height. So for the bottom frame, I cut them to 4 inches. And then for the other 2 frames, I cut the PVC boards to 5 inches to cover over those frame boards. Before I could attach the top board, I needed to notch out this piece on the skirting with my Dremel Multimax. And then I also needed to notch out a little place here so that it could wrap around the step. I used my circular saw for that one. And once those things were notched out, then the board fit just perfectly. And then I also had to notch out the second board to fit around the step, but the bottom board didn't need any notching at all. And here's what they looked like in place on both sides. And then I just had to cut the risers. For the risers, I measured all 3 of them individually because when you're working with lumber like 2x12s, 2x6s, that kind of rough cut lumber, things can be off 1/8 of an inch very easily. Sometimes 1/4 of an inch. So you want to be sure and take measurements for each and everything that you need to cut. Don't just assume that they're all going to be the same. Then I cut those boards with my miter saw and ripped them down to the right height with my table saw and then nailed them into place. And you can see how that just finishes off those steps. I think it looks so nice to have the white risers and the stained steps. I nailed these into place with 16 gauge nails, and I didn't worry too much about nailing it right into those spacers. It really didn't matter. They're just 1/4 inch spacers, so if I miss the spacers, it's fine. And here's what it looked like finished. I still need to caulk and paint, but I'm waiting on that because I have a couple of other projects that I need to caulk and paint, and I just want to do it all at the same time. Also, the weather hasn't been very cooperative lately, so I need a stretch of good weather in order to do all of the caulking and painting on all of these projects. But for now, I think this looks fantastic, and what a huge upgrade over those concrete steps. So just as a reminder, here's what my little building started out looking like, just a gray, boring building. And here it is today with its new shutters, a painted front door, skirting, and new steps. I have several more projects planned, so stay tuned. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so that you'll get notifications when I post new videos. And as always, you can find me and my latest projects over on addictedtodecorating.com. See you next time.